Throughout the Second World War, there were many spies that worked in different countries to provide information to armies. It was hoped that this information would be valuable to the war effort. For example, the British had established large networks of spies inside of France, who passed on information and worked as couriers for the French resistance. Special Operations Executive, as it was known, helped to carry out many acts of espionage, but those who were captured conducting this undercover work were often sent to concentration camps, and many were executed in terrible ways. For example, a number of female spies were even burned alive inside the ovens of a concentration camp, and their screams were piercing, as the other prisoners recounted. But there were a number of German spies who were executed during the war, and one of them was even executed inside the Tower of London, the medieval fortress where Henry VIII executed two of his own wives. However, one of the most shocking executions of the war took place at the hands of the Americans, as a US Army firing squad executed two teenage German spies. Join us today to look at the executions of the teenage Hitler Youth spies, and remember as always to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. The Hitler Youth were an organisation established by the Nazis, and it was a youth group that boys would join. The Hitler Youth was a tool used to indoctrinate young boys, and the members were raised basically to become soldiers, and it was hoped that all of the Hitler Youth would one day be motivated soldiers who would lay their life down for the Third Reich. As time went on, the membership to the group became mandatory, and German boys faced immense pressure to join. Hitler said of the youth groups for boys and girls, "These boys and girls enter our organisations with their 10 years of age, and often for the first time get a little fresh air. After 4 years of the young folk, they then go to the Hitler Youth, where we have had them for another 4 years, and even if they are still not complete National Socialists, they go to labour service and are smoothed out there for another 6 or 7 months, and whatever class consciousness or social status might be left, the Wehrmacht will take care of that." Some boys did drop out due to the discipline and regimented nature of the group, but then some rejoined as they found out they could not get a job or go to university if they were not a member. Ultimately, the main age range for the group was boys of around 14 to 18, and eventually the member numbers rose to 8 million. This was a huge amount, and Hitler realised that having 8 million virulent and passionate Nazi boys at his disposal could have some involvement in the German war effort, and could be a useful tool for him. But during the Second World War, the Hitler Youth played an important role in the German war effort. Arthur Axmann would change the group from a simple youth group to become an auxiliary force, which could perform duties during the war when it was called upon. The Hitler Youth then became part of the German fire brigades, and they also helped with recovery following Allied bombing raids. They also took part in civilian work including the Reich Postal Service, working on the railways, and other roles in government positions. But then many of the group were trained to become part of anti-aircraft defences. They would be involved in shooting down Allied aircraft, but they were also vulnerable to attack. But then as the war effort continued, the Nazis then began to turn the Hitler Youth into becoming a military reserve, to eventually replace the soldiers who had been killed in action during operations such as Barbarossa, where heavy losses were sustained. There were plans for a Waffen SS division comprised of Hitler Youth members, and the combat division of practically children born in 1926 was passed to Hitler for his approval, and he gave this its confirmation. In 1944, the SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth was deployed during the Battle of Normandy, and 20,000 German youngsters took part in the attempts to defend against the D-Day landings. They managed to knock out 28 Canadian tanks, but 3,000 members were lost before the assault on Normandy had even finished. But the Hitler Youth Division became known for its loyalty to the Nazi cause and its ferocity. These were dangerous young men who had been brainwashed. But even as the war turned against the Germans, young men were being brought into the conflict, and there were even 12-year-old boys who were drafted into the Volkssturm to defend during the Battle of Berlin. These young boys were equipped with weapons such as Panzerfaust, and they were the last line of German defences. But as the war was in its final months, and as the Germans dug in heavily to defend, members of the Hitler Youth found themselves also conducting espionage and spy work for the Wehrmacht and the German army. It was hoped by the Nazis that the boys would attract little suspicion with the enemies, and they infiltrated the areas where the British, American, and other Allied armies were liberating and also setting up bases. Near to Braunschweig in Germany, there were members of the Hitler Youth who were conducting spying on the Allies, and then they were passing this information on further to try and rally the Germans to attack where specifically the Americans were based. The US Army knew this was happening, and they began to treat many people with suspicion, and even local girls and women came under suspicion for being spies, and there was a discouragement of fraternisation with the locals. But on the 1st of June 1945, there were two teenage boys, a lad aged 16 and another aged 17, who were marched out into a quarry by the American soldiers. They were then fastened to a stake and were executed by a firing squad. But why were these two youngsters executed? Heinz Petry, a 16-year-old boy, and Josef Schoner, a 17-year-old boy, had been captured by the Allies, and they were accused of espionage by the Americans. The pair had been trained in how to use pistols and rifles, and also how to work with explosives for the Werwolf secret organisation, which was to disrupt the Allies. Schoner was a Hitler Youth leader, and along with others he was transferred to Bergheim. On the 21st of February 1945, Petry was sent to the front line with Schoner to spy on the troop strength of the American army. They were to report on what they saw to the German military, and they were conducting reconnaissance on the enemy. But on the 22nd of February 1945, the two teenage boys were picked up by the 9th United States Army near to Bergden and were found hiding in a foxhole, reporting on American movements. The Americans found the boys in civilian clothes and not in uniform, and because of this they were treated and classified as spies. Under interrogation, Petry, the 16-year-old, admitted being a spy. They were then imprisoned in Aachen prison. There was a day-long hearing in front of a US military court, made up of members of the 9th Army, and the pair, despite their age, were sentenced to death by firing squad on the 29th of March 1945 in a court-martial in Mönchengladbach for committing acts of espionage which were damaging to the war effort. The jury of officers came up with a two-thirds majority, and the death sentences were carried out to show the German people how serious the Americans were to remove the poisonous breath of German militarism and Nazi ideology from the face of the earth completely. On the 30th of May 1945, as the war in Europe had come to an end, the boys were transferred to Braunschweig detention centre, and they were informed that their pleas for clemency had been rejected, and instead they were told that their executions were imminent. Heinz Petry, the 16-year-old, wrote a 6-page farewell letter to his parents and brother on the night before his execution. However, on the 1st of June 1945, the pair were told they were to be executed. They were taken on a short journey to the gravel pit quarry, which was situated nearby, and Petry, being the youngest, was the first to be executed. He was led out to his execution flanked by American guards and a priest who remained with him, and he was then led to a wooden stake, which had been secured against a gravel bank. The officials then tied his arms behind his back and also his legs and secured him to the post. The firing squad then emerged, and this was made up of 12 soldiers from the 9th Army with their rifles. They were not far from their target at all. They were then told to ready themselves by the officer, who was behind the shooters. Quickly and swiftly they shot straight into their target, and the 16-year-old Heinz Petry was executed. His body was then, after the execution, placed into a coffin by employees of the German Red Cross. Following Petry's execution, Schoner was then executed in the same manner, along with 4 other spies who were executed that day by soldiers of the US 9th Army. The execution did attract criticism, as some believed the boys should have been spared due to their ages. But following the executions, Heinz Petry was buried in Braunschweig's main cemetery, and Josef Schoner was buried in the Catholic cemetery. Petry's remains were later exhumed at the request of his family, and were moved back to his hometown. The execution of the teenage Hitler Youth members by some groups around the world was seen as an unnecessary one, considering the war in Europe had come to an end. But for the Americans it was considered an important step in showing the German population that those who had committed crimes against the Allies should be punished, and it showed the Germans that the soon-to-be occupiers would not be pushovers. But at the end of the day, Heinz Petry was just 16 when he was executed in the gravel quarry, and Josef Schoner was just 17 when he was shot dead. These two remain some of the youngest to have been executed by the Allies during the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.